Sometimes the most broken things are the ones worth saving. In the harsh frontier of 1880s America, where mercy was scarce and trust scarcer, Cowboy Luke Carson discovered a truth that would change everything. Chained to a weathered fence post, a fierce dog snarled behind a crude wooden sign, "Too dangerous." Most folks would have walked away, but Luke saw something different in those wild eyes, not just rage but pain. Against every warning, Luke made a choice that would test both spirits as bandits threatened and betrayal lurked. But what happens when the people Luke trusted most turn against him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This remarkable tale of redemption and unwavering loyalty will stay with you long after the very last word. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Luke Carson's homestead, its golden rays catching the dust motes that danced through the dry Montana air. At 53, Luke had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades spent working with rope, leather, and steel, hands that had built this modest ranch from nothing more than stubborn determination and the savings from his years as a cavalry scout. His father's military compass sat on the kitchen table where he took his morning coffee, its brass surface polished smooth by countless touches over the years. The compass had guided 3 generations of Carson men through uncertain territory, and now it served as Luke's daily reminder that sometimes a man needed to trust his internal direction when the world offered no clear path forward. Luke had never married, though it wasn't for lack of opportunity. Sarah McKinnon had waited for him to return from his final scouting mission in '78. But by the time he'd made it back to Clearwater Falls, she'd already accepted Thomas Wright's proposal. He'd stood in the back of the church during their wedding, hat in hand, genuinely happy for her happiness, even as his own heart carried the quiet ache of roads not taken. The isolation suited him now, though. His ranch sat 12 miles northeast of Clearwater Falls, far enough from town that unexpected visitors were rare, close enough that he could ride in for supplies when the weather permitted. The land was harsh but honest. It gave back exactly what a man put into it, no more, no less. His small herd of cattle grazed the high meadow behind the house, and his quarter-horse Duke had grown old and comfortable in the barn that Luke had built board by board during his first winter here. Townspeople of Clearwater Falls knew Luke Carson as a man of few words and steady character. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a good 15 years younger than Luke, but wise enough to value experience, often sought his counsel on matters involving tracking or understanding the movement of unsavory characters through their territory. Mrs. Henderson, at the general store, always set aside the good coffee beans when they came in on the supply wagon, knowing Luke would pay fair price and never haggled over necessities. But Luke's deepest friendship was with Father Miguel Santos, the parish priest, who'd arrived from New Mexico 3 years prior. Despite their different paths, Luke had seen enough of war and violence to question the presence of divine mercy, while Father Miguel maintained an unshakable faith in redemption. The two men found common ground in their shared understanding of solitude and service. They played chess most Sunday evenings after services, their conversations meandering through philosophy and practical wisdom with the easy comfort of men who'd both seen enough of life to appreciate its quieter moments. "You've got the heart of a protector, Luke," Father Miguel had observed during one of their games, moving his knight with careful deliberation. "But you're protecting yourself from something. A man can't spend his whole life standing guard." Luke had studied the chessboard for a long moment before responding. "Sometimes standing guard is what keeps everyone else safe, Padre." It was a truth that ran deeper than Luke cared to examine too closely. His years as a cavalry scout had shown him the worst of what men could do to each other when civilization's thin veneer wore away. He'd tracked war parties, rescued captives, and delivered messages through hostile territory where a single mistake meant death not just for himself, but for the people depending on him to succeed. The responsibility had carved something permanent into his character, a hypervigilance that made peaceful sleep difficult and sudden noises cause his hand to drift instinctively toward the Colt .45 he still wore on his hip, the scars on his left shoulder, courtesy of a Lakota arrow during his second-to-last mission, ached when storms approached. The deeper scar, the one that didn't show, came from watching too many good men die while following orders that seemed to make sense from a distance but crumbled into moral ambiguity when measured against the cost in blood and suffering. Luke's daily routine had settled into a rhythm that suited his temperament. Dawn brought coffee and a careful survey of his property from the porch, noting any changes in the cattle's behavior, the condition of his fences, the direction of the wind. Morning meant maintenance. There was always something that needed fixing, mending, or improvement on a ranch. Afternoon brought the physical work of ranching, checking water sources, moving cattle when necessary, cutting wood for the approaching winter. Evenings were for reflection. Luke would sit on his porch as the sun set, Duke grazing nearby, and let his mind wander over the decisions that had brought him to this place. He'd read by lamplight, mostly practical books about animal husbandry and agriculture, but occasionally philosophy or history borrowed from Father Miguel's small library. The priest had been gradually introducing him to works that wrestled with questions of forgiveness and redemption, though Luke approached such texts with the skepticism of a man who'd seen enough unforgivable acts to question whether some roads could truly be walked backward. The people of Clearwater Falls respected Luke's privacy, but they also recognized his value to their community. When the Hendersons' youngest boy had gone missing last spring, it was Luke who'd tracked the 7-year-old to a cave system 3 miles north of town, following sign that others had missed, and understanding the thinking of a frightened child well enough to predict his likely hiding spots. When rustlers had been hitting ranches south of town, Sheriff Bradley had asked Luke to scout their movements and patterns, knowledge that had led to their eventual capture without bloodshed, yet for all his integration into the community's informal network of mutual support, Luke maintained careful boundaries around his personal life. He attended church services, but didn't linger for the social conversations afterward. He participated in the community barn raising when the Johnsons needed help after their fire, but declined the dinner invitation that followed. He was present when needed, absent when privacy was required, a balance that kept him connected without becoming vulnerable. The loneliness was real, though Luke rarely acknowledged it directly. It showed itself in the way he spoke to Duke while working, carrying on one-sided conversations about plans for improving the ranch or observations about the weather. It appeared in his careful attention to letters from his sister Catherine back in Kansas, reading and rereading her updates about her children's lives, his nephews and nieces, growing up in photographs that arrived twice yearly. Most tellingly, it revealed itself in his treatment of the occasional injured animal he encountered on his property. Luke had set the broken leg of a young deer the previous autumn, keeping the animal in his barn for 6 weeks while it healed, speaking to it in the same gentle tones he'd once used with spooked horses during his scouting days. When he finally released it back to the wild, he'd watched from his porch as it bounded away, feeling both pride in its recovery and a sharp pang of emptiness at its departure. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who'd spent years tracking dangerous men and navigating hostile territory now found his greatest challenge in navigating the simple human need for connection without compromising the hard-won peace he'd built for himself. Luke Carson was a man caught between his nature as a protector and his need for protection from the very intimacy that his protective instincts made him long to defend. As autumn deepened into the promise of another harsh Montana winter, Luke found himself thinking more frequently about legacy and purpose. His cattle would fetch good prices in the spring. His ranch was profitable in its modest way, but he sometimes wondered what mark he was leaving on the world beyond his own survival. The compass on his kitchen table had guided his father through the Mexican-American War and his grandfather through early frontier settlement, but Luke's own journey seemed to circle back on itself, protective but ultimately solitary. It was into this carefully balanced, deliberately circumscribed life that fate would soon introduce a test that would challenge every assumption Luke had made about the costs and rewards of opening one's heart to the broken things that needed saving. The morning he would encounter the chained dog was still 2 days away, but the foundations for that fateful decision were already laid in the character of a man who understood both the necessity of protection and the terrible price of perfect safety. The heavy iron chain wrapped around the fence post had been forged by skilled hands, each link thick enough to hold a bull. Luke could see the craftsmanship even from a distance as he approached the abandoned property on the eastern edge of his land, where old Henrik Jorgensen had tried unsuccessfully to farm before giving up and moving back to Minnesota the previous spring. The chain represented more than restraint. It spoke of someone's deliberate investment in containing whatever had been secured to that weathered post. Luke had ridden out to check the fence line between his property and the Jorgensen place, planning to repair the sections where winter damage had loosened posts and scattered rails. The work was routine maintenance, the kind of solitary task that allowed his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. Duke picked his way carefully through the sparse grass, ears forward with the alertness of a horse trained to notice changes. In familiar territory, the sound reached them first, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, followed by the distinctive rattle of chain against wood. Duke's ears flattened, and Luke felt the horse's muscles tense. Beneath the saddle, whatever was making that sound had been there for some time, judging by the worn circle of bare earth around the fence post and the scattered bones of small animals that hadn't been buried by the recent rains. As they crested the low rise that overlooked the abandoned homestead, Luke got his first clear view of the dog. The animal was large, easily 80 pounds of muscle and matted fur, with the broad chest and powerful shoulders of a breed built for fighting or guarding. Its coat had once been black, but dirt and neglect had turned it a dull, muddy brown. The dog's lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth yellowed by poor diet, but still capable of serious damage. But it was the sign that made Luke's jaw tighten with anger. Someone had taken the time to paint "too dangerous" in unsteady letters across a piece of scrap lumber, then nailed it to the fence post above the dog's head, like a judgment rendered without trial or appeal. The paint was fresh enough that it hadn't completely faded, suggesting the dog had been abandoned recently, left to die slowly rather than killed outright. Luke dismounted carefully, keeping Duke between himself and the snarling animal, while he studied the situation. The chain was perhaps 8 feet long, giving the dog enough room to seek shelter under a lean-to made of weathered boards, but not enough freedom to reach the fence line or any source of water beyond a rusty bucket that had been knocked over and lay empty in the dirt. The dog's eyes tracked Luke's movement with intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. There was calculation there, and wariness born of experience rather than simple fear. This wasn't a creature that had turned dangerous from natural disposition. This was an animal that had been made dangerous by circumstance, by treatment that had taught it to expect pain and betrayal from human contact. Luke approached slowly, speaking in the same quiet tone he'd used with spooked horses during his cavalry days. "Easy there, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you." The dog's growling intensified, but Luke caught something else in its expression, a flicker of confusion, as if kindness was a language it half remembered but couldn't quite trust. The evidence of the dog's suffering was written in its gaunt frame and the raw patches where the heavy collar had rubbed against its neck. Someone had fed it just enough to keep it alive, but not enough to maintain its strength. The cruelty was methodical, designed to break the animal's spirit through systematic neglect rather than outright violence. Luke had seen enough abandoned animals during his years of frontier travel to recognize the signs of deliberate mistreatment. This dog had been socialized to humans at some point. Its wariness was learned rather than instinctive, suggesting it had once known gentler treatment before being betrayed by the very beings it had been bred to serve and protect. "What kind of man chains up a dog and leaves it to die?" Luke asked aloud, though he wasn't really expecting an answer. Luke snorted and pawed the ground, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity to the snarling animal, but trusting Luke's judgment enough to remain steady. The dog lunged suddenly against the chain, the heavy links snapping taut with a sound like a gunshot. Its bark was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. Luke stepped back instinctively, his hand moving to the colt at his hip, before conscious thought reminded him that the animal was more victim than threat. "You've got fight left in you," Luke observed, and there was something approaching approval in his voice. "That's good. Means you haven't given up yet." The ride back to town for supplies gave Luke time to think about what he'd seen and what he intended to do about it. By the time he tied Duke to the hitching post outside Brady's general store, he'd made his decision, though he suspected it wouldn't be a popular one among the townspeople of Clearwater Falls. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her inventory ledger. As Luke entered, her weathered face creasing into the kind of smile reserved for customers who paid their bills promptly and never caused trouble. "Afternoon, Luke. What brings you to town on a Wednesday?" "Need some supplies, Mrs. Henderson. Heavy rope, a good leather collar, and about 10 pounds of your best beef scraps." Luke kept his voice casual, but he could see the shopkeeper's curiosity sharpening at the unusual request. "Planning to get yourself a dog?" she asked, pulling the items from their respective shelves. "Been thinking you could use some company out at that ranch of yours." Before Luke could respond, the store's front door opened with its familiar squeak of hinges that needed oil. Sheriff Bradley entered, his badge catching the afternoon light that streamed through the dusty windows. Tom Bradley was a good man and a competent lawman, but he had the kind of cautious nature that came from taking responsibility for other people's safety. "Luke," Bradley nodded in greeting, then noticed the supplies being gathered on the counter. "Mrs. Henderson, please tell me you're not selling rope and dog supplies to someone planning to deal with that dangerous animal over at the old Jorgensen place." Luke felt both their eyes on him as he carefully counted out the coins for his purchase. "News travels fast in a small town." "Fast enough," Bradley replied. "Billy Hendricks saw you riding out that way this morning, and Mrs. Patterson spotted you heading back toward town around noon. When you walk into the store asking for rope and dog gear on the same day, it doesn't take a detective to connect the pieces." Mrs. Henderson's expression had shifted from curiosity to concern. "Luke, you can't be thinking of approaching that animal. The man who left it there, Carl Brennan, rides with those rough types from the mining camps. He told Sheriff Bradley the dog had killed a man down in Colorado. Said it was too dangerous to shoot close to town on account of the ricochet risk, so he chained it up where it would die natural-like." Luke's jaw tightened. "And you believed him?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Brennan's not the most reliable source, but the dog's certainly aggressive. Snarled and lunged at everyone who's ridden past since it was left there. Mrs. Patterson won't even use that road anymore, says the sound carries clear to her house and frightens the children. An animal that's been chained without water for days might have cause to be aggressive," Luke replied evenly. "Doesn't make it dangerous by nature." "Luke." Bradley's voice carried the weight of official authority, tempered by genuine concern. "I'm asking you, as your friend and as the law in this county, to stay away from that animal. If you're determined to do something about the situation, I can organize a group of men to put it down humanely." Luke gathered his supplies and tucked them into his saddlebags with deliberate care. "Sheriff, I've tracked more dangerous things than one starving dog. I can take care of myself." "It's not just about you taking care of yourself," Mrs. Henderson interjected. "What happens if you get that animal loose and it wanders into town? What happens if it goes after someone's children?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of community responsibility, and the kind of practical fear that kept small towns safe. Luke understood their concerns, even respected them. But he also understood something they didn't: the difference between an animal made dangerous by circumstance and one that was dangerous by nature. "I appreciate your concern," he said finally, "both of you, but that dog's not getting a fair judgment chained to a post and left to starve." He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing about a situation is the assumptions people make about it." The late afternoon sun slanted across the dusty main street as Luke untied Duke and prepared to ride home. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of concerned voices as Sheriff Bradley and Mrs. Henderson continued their discussion. By evening, half the town would know about his plans, and by tomorrow morning, the other half would have heard the story with embellishments. But Luke had faced community disapproval before, and he'd learned that a man's character was often defined, not by the decisions that earned approval, but by the ones that required him to act according to his conscience, despite the cost in social comfort. The worn leather glove had belonged to Luke's father, passed down along with the military compass, and a handful of other treasures that connected one generation to the next. Luke had carried it in his saddlebags for years, using it when handling barbed wire or working with particularly skittish horses. Now, as he approached the chained dog for the second time in as many days, the glove represented something more than protection. It was a bridge between his past experience with difficult animals and the challenge that snarled and paced before him. Luke had spent the previous evening preparing for this encounter with the methodical patience that had served him well during his scouting years. The beef scraps Mrs. Henderson had provided sat soaking in warm broth, softening them for teeth that had grown unaccustomed to regular meals. He'd cut the heavy rope into manageable lengths, fashioned a slipknot that could be tightened or loosened quickly, and practiced the timing he'd need to secure the dog safely once the chain was removed. The morning air carried the scent of approaching autumn as Luke rode Duke to within 50 yards of the fence post, close enough to observe the dog's behavior, but far enough away to avoid triggering its defensive instincts. The animal had heard their approach. Its ears were forward, alert, but the constant snarling of the previous day had subsided into watchful wariness. Luke dismounted and ground-tied Duke with practiced efficiency, then gathered his supplies and began walking slowly toward the dog. Each step was deliberate, calculated to appear non-threatening, while maintaining enough distance to retreat if necessary. The dog's muscles tensed as Luke drew closer, but it didn't immediately lunge against the chain. "Morning, boy," Luke spoke quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used with countless horses over the years. "Brought you something that might taste better than whatever you've been scrounging." He stopped at the edge of the dog's range and crouched down, making himself less imposing while keeping his hands visible. From this position, he could see the intelligence in the animal's eyes more clearly. There was calculation there, a mind working through possibilities and probabilities with the kind of strategic thinking that spoke of breeding and training, rather than simple, wild instinct. Luke placed a piece of the soaked beef on the ground, just beyond the dog's reach, then retreated several steps. The animal's nose twitched, catching the scent of real food, but its eyes never left Luke's face. Minutes passed in silence, the tension broken only by Duke's occasional snort and the distant sound of wind through dry grass. Finally, the dog stretched forward as far as the chain would allow, straining to reach the offering. When it became clear that Luke had positioned the food just beyond range, the animal's frustration erupted in a series of sharp barks that carried across the empty landscape like gunshots. "I know," Luke said calmly. "It's right there, but you can't quite get to it. Kind of like trust, isn't it? Sometimes the thing you want most is just outside your reach until you're willing to take a risk." He moved the beef closer, placing it where the dog could reach it without fully extending the chain. This time, the animal's approach was more cautious, eyes darting between the food and Luke's position as if expecting a trap or trick. When it finally grabbed the meat, it retreated immediately to the far end of its tether, wolfing down the food with desperate hunger. Luke continued this process for the better part of an hour, each offering placed slightly closer to his own position, requiring the dog to venture nearer to human contact in order to feed. The animal's wariness began to give way to pragmatic cooperation. It wanted the food, and experience was teaching it that this particular human didn't accompany feeding with violence or cruelty. By the time Luke placed the fourth piece of beef at the edge of the dog's immediate reach, the animal was willing to eat while he remained within arm's length, though its posture remained ready to flee or fight at the first sign of threat. The transformation wasn't dramatic, trust measured in inches rather than miles, but it represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between them. "That's better," Luke murmured, carefully extending his gloved hand toward the dog's muzzle. "Nobody's going to hurt you, boy, not anymore." The dog's reaction was swift and instinctive. It snapped at the approaching hand, teeth clicking against leather with enough force to have broken skin, if not for the protection. But Luke didn't flinch or retreat. He held his position, hand steady, voice calm. "I know you're scared. I know people have hurt you before. But you're going to have to decide whether you want to stay chained to this post forever or take a chance on something different." The second approach was more tentative, the dog's nose twitching as it caught Luke's scent through the leather. This time, when it didn't detect the familiar signs of human aggression, it allowed the briefest contact, Luke's fingers barely brushing the coarse fur between its ears before it pulled back. The moment of contact sent a jolt of recognition through both man and animal. For the dog, it was the first gentle human touch it had experienced in months, possibly years. For Luke, it was a reminder of the profound responsibility that came with earning the trust of something that had every reason to reject human contact. "Entirely. Good boy," Luke said softly, and the dog's ears flickered at the unfamiliar praise. "We're going to figure this out together." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their fragile progress. Luke straightened, recognizing the steady rhythm of Sheriff Bradley's mount long before the lawman came into view over the ridge. The dog immediately tensed at the new presence, its brief relaxation replaced by renewed vigilance. Bradley rode, up with the careful bearing of a man who expected trouble but hoped to avoid it. His hand rested casually near his sidearm, a precaution that Luke noticed but didn't comment upon. "Morning, Luke. I see you're still determined to pursue this particular course of action." "Morning, Tom. Just feeding a hungry animal." Luke's voice remained steady, but he positioned himself slightly between the sheriff and the dog, an unconscious gesture of protection that didn't go unnoticed. "Mrs. Patterson sent her boy to fetch me. Said she heard barking and was concerned." "You might be in danger." Bradley's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the empty beef scraps scattered around the fence post, the dog's marginally calmer demeanor, and Luke's relaxed posture. "I have to admit, the animal seems less agitated than yesterday." "Hunger and thirst can make any creature desperate," Luke replied. "Feed it properly, treat it with respect, and you might be surprised by the results." Bradley dismounted and approached slowly, stopping well outside the dog's range. The animal's growling resumed at his presence, but Luke noticed it was more warning than threat, a declaration of territorial boundaries rather than murderous intent. "Luke, I need to ask you directly. What's your plan here? You can't keep riding out here indefinitely to feed a chained dog, and you sure as hell can't bring it into town." Luke pulled off his father's glove and studied the teeth marks that had scored the leather surface. Such small damage from such a desperate act. Evidence of restraint rather than viciousness. Proof that even in its fear and hunger, the dog had chosen to warn rather than wound. "My plan is to give this animal the choice it's never had before," Luke said finally. "The choice to trust or not trust, to be gentle or aggressive, to prove what it really is when it's not chained to a post and left to die." The sheriff's expression showed the kind of resignation that came from recognizing an immovable object when he encountered one. "And if you're wrong about its nature?" If Carl Brennan was telling the truth about its history? Luke looked at the dog, now lying in the shade of its makeshift shelter, but still watching both men with alert intelligence. Then I'll deal with the consequences. But I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, Tom. I'd rather be wrong about trusting something that deserved it than be right about condemning something that didn't. The old saddle blanket had seen Luke through countless miles of frontier territory, its wool fibers worn soft by years of faithful service beneath various horses in all kinds of weather. Now, as he spread it carefully on the ground near the chained dog's resting spot, it represented something more profound than simple comfort. It was Luke's first attempt to create a shared space where trust could take root and grow. 3 days of patient visits had yielded remarkable progress. The dog no longer lunged against its chain when Luke approached, and it had begun to anticipate his arrival, rising from its shelter with something that almost resembled eagerness when it heard Duke's hoofbeats in the distance. The systematic feeding routine had filled out the animal's gaunt frame slightly, and regular access to fresh water had cleared the discharge from its eyes. Luke settled onto the blanket with deliberate casualness, close enough to the dog that they shared the same patch of shade, but far enough away that neither felt threatened by the other's presence. From his saddlebags, he produced a piece of jerky and began eating it slowly, making no attempt to offer any to the dog, but ensuring that the scent of food permeated the air between them. "Been thinking about you, boy," Luke said conversationally, as if speaking to an old friend rather than a supposedly dangerous animal. "Wondering what your story is, how you ended up chained to this post like some kind of criminal." The dog's ears perked forward at the sound of Luke's voice. Over the past few days, it had begun to associate that particular tone with safety and food, though its muscles remained coiled with the readiness that spoke of hard-learned survival instincts. Luke continued eating and talking, sharing observations about the weather, the approaching winter, and the challenges of ranch life. It was a one-sided conversation, but he noticed the dog's gradual relaxation as it grew accustomed to the rhythm of human speech without the accompanying threat of violence. "You know what I think?" Luke asked, carefully extending a piece of jerky toward the dog. "I think somebody trained you once, trained you well too, judging by the way you watch for signals and respond to voice commands." As if to prove his point, Luke said, "Sit," in the same firm but gentle tone he'd used with countless horses. The dog's rear end hit the ground immediately, an automatic response that surprised them both. For a moment, man and animal stared at each other in mutual recognition, the dog realizing it had revealed the depth of its previous training. Luke understanding that he was dealing with an animal that had once known discipline and structure. "Well, I'll be," Luke murmured, genuine admiration in his voice. "Somebody did right by you once, didn't they?" The dog's tail gave the slightest wag, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there. It was the first positive gesture Luke had witnessed from the animal, a crack in the armor of defensive aggression that had protected it through weeks of abandonment and neglect. Luke spent the remainder of that morning working on basic commands, testing the extent of the dog's training while simultaneously rebuilding its confidence through praise and rewards. The animal knew sit, stay, and down, executing each command with the precision of extensive practice, though its responses carried the hesitancy of a creature that had learned to expect punishment for mistakes. "Somebody put a lot of work into you," Luke observed, as the dog performed a flawless downstay for nearly 5 minutes. "Question is, what happened to that somebody? And how did you end up with Carl Brennan?" The answer to that question arrived sooner than Luke anticipated, in the form of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. But these weren't the measured cadence of Sheriff Bradley's patrol horse. These were the harder, more urgent sounds of riders pushing their mounts to cover ground quickly. Luke rose from the blanket, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip as 4 men crested the ridge and rode toward the abandoned homestead. He recognized Carl Brennan immediately, A lean, weathered man with the kind of eyes that seemed to catalogue weaknesses in everything they looked upon. The three men with him had the rough appearance of mining camp labourers, the type who supplemented their income with whatever opportunities presented themselves, legal or otherwise. The dog's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The relaxed animal that had been performing commands moments earlier erupted into a snarling, lunging fury, straining against its chain with such violence that Luke worried it might injure itself. The hatred in its eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't generalized fear of strangers, but specific recognition of a particular threat. "Well, well," Brennan called out as he approached, staying carefully outside the dog's range. "Heard tell you were out here trying to tame my old dog, Carson. Thought you might have more sense than that." Luke stepped forward, positioning himself between Brennan and the animal. "Your dog? Funny way of caring for something you own, chaining it to a post without food or water." Brennan's laugh held no humor. "That dog killed a man down in Colorado Springs, tore out his throat while he was sleeping in his bedroll. Only reason I didn't put a bullet in it right then was I figured it might be useful for guarding claims and such, but it's too unpredictable, too mean. Finally decided the best thing was to let it die natural-like." "Natural-like," Luke repeated, his voice flat with disgust. "You mean let it starve to death slowly, instead of having the courage to put it down cleanly?" One of Brennan's companions, a heavy-set man with scarred knuckles and predator's eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Maybe the old man's got feelings for the beast, Carl. Maybe he thinks he can make a pet out of a killer." The dog's fury intensified at the sound of the man's voice, and Luke noticed something that chilled him. The animal recognized this man too. Whatever had happened to turn a well-trained dog into a supposedly vicious killer, these men had been part of it. "Here's what's going to happen, Carson," Brennan continued, his tone taking on the false reasonableness that dangerous men used when they wanted to appear civilized. "You're going to walk away from this animal and leave it be. It's mine, legally. Speaking, and I'll dispose of it as I see fit." Luke's response was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that made horses stand still and men think twice about their next words. "And here's what's actually going to happen, Brennan. You're going to ride away from here and leave this animal alone. If I see you or your friends near this dog again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation." The tension stretched between the two groups like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Luke was outnumbered 4-1, but his reputation as a former cavalry scout carried weight in this part of Montana. More importantly, he had positioned himself with the tactical advantage of cover behind the fence post and the high ground of moral authority. Brennan's eyes narrowed as he calculated odds and consequences. After a long moment, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Carson. That dog's got blood on its teeth, and sooner or later it's going to taste more." As the four men rode away, Luke remained standing guard until their dust had settled beyond the horizon. Only then did he turn back to the dog, which had collapsed in exhaustion from its violent struggle against the chain. "They hurt you, didn't they, boy?" Luke asked softly, kneeling beside the panting animal. "Whatever story they're telling about you killing a man, I'm betting the real truth is a lot different." The dog's eyes met his, and in that gaze, Luke saw something that confirmed his growing suspicions. This wasn't a killer dog. This was a victim that had been pushed beyond endurance, then abandoned when its usefulness ended. Luke made his decision with the finality that had carried him through dangerous territory during his scouting years. Tomorrow he would return with bolt cutters and a plan. The dog was coming home with him, whatever the consequences. That evening, he sat on his own porch, cleaning his father's old Colt .45 and thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Sheriff Bradley. Some battles chose you rather than the other way around, and Luke Carson had just discovered that saving one abandoned dog might require him to confront more than he'd bargained for. The heavy bolt cutters had belonged to the railroad crew that built the spur line through Clearwater Falls 5 years earlier, left behind when the work was finished and forgotten in the back corner of Murphy's blacksmith shop until Luke purchased them for twice their original cost. Now, as he hefted their weight and tested their grip on the thick iron chain, they represented more than simple tools. They were instruments of liberation, capable of severing the bonds that had held an innocent creature captive. Dawn was still, an hour away, when Luke arrived at the abandoned homestead, moving with the practiced silence of his cavalry scouting days. He'd deliberately chosen this early hour to minimize the chance of witnesses, knowing that what he was about to do would be viewed as theft by some and dangerous folly by others. The dog sensed his approach before Duke's hooves touched the ground, rising from its shelter with alert anticipation rather than defensive aggression. "Morning, boy," Luke whispered, dismounting with careful quietness. "Today's the day we find out what kind of dog you really are when nobody's got you chained to a post." The bolt cutters made quick work of the chain, each cut producing a sharp, metallic snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The dog watched with intelligent eyes as link after link fell away, until only the heavy collar remained around its neck, a leather and metal reminder of captivity that Luke decided could wait until the animal felt safer in its new surroundings. The moment of freedom was anticlimactic. Instead of bounding away or attacking, the dog simply stood there, looking confused by the absence of the familiar resistance that had defined its world for weeks. Luke had prepared for various possibilities. The animal might run, might cower, might even become aggressive without the security of known boundaries, but he hadn't anticipated this bewildered stillness. "Come on, boy," Luke said softly, slapping his thigh in the universal invitation that dogs had recognized for thousands of years. Time to go home. The walk to where Duke waited was a careful negotiation of trust and uncertainty. The dog followed, but at a distance that could quickly become flight if needed. Every few steps, it would stop and look back at the fence post, as if ensuring its prison was truly gone, before continuing its cautious advance toward an uncertain future. Loading the animal into Duke's saddle presented challenges that Luke's frontier experience hadn't prepared him for. The dog was too large and too weak from its ordeal to jump up on its own, but too distrustful to accept being lifted. The compromise they worked out involved Luke dismounting and walking alongside Duke while the dog followed, a procession that turned the normal 20-minute ride into an hour-long journey of patient progress. The sun was well up by the time they'd reached Luke's ranch, painting the modest homestead in shades of gold that made it seem more welcoming than usual. The dog's behavior changed as they approached the buildings. Its posture shifted from wary following to active investigation, nose twitching as it catalogued the scents of horses, cattle, and the accumulated markers of human habitation that spelled safety to domesticated animals. Luke had prepared a space in the barn, sectioning off a corner stall with loose boards that would contain the dog without making it feel trapped. Fresh straw covered the ground, a water bucket sat within easy reach, and the whole area was positioned to catch the morning sun while remaining protected from weather. "This is yours," Luke explained, opening the makeshift gate and stepping aside to let the dog explore. "Nobody's going to chain you up, nobody's going to hurt you, and you'll get fed regular whether you earn it or not." The dog's investigation of its new quarters was thorough and methodical. It sniffed every corner, tested the straw with cautious paws, and checked the security of the walls with the kind of attention that spoke of previous experience with confinement. Finally, apparently satisfied that this prison could be exited at will, it settled into the straw with a deep sigh that seemed to release weeks of accumulated tension. Luke spent the morning working within sight of the barn, repairing harness, leather, and maintaining equipment, while keeping one eye on his new guest. The dog dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, but gradually relaxing as it learned the rhythm of ranch life. The lowing of cattle, Duke's occasional whinny from the corral, the familiar creaks and settles of buildings adjusting to changing temperatures. The first real test came when Luke approached with the dog's midday meal. He'd prepared a mixture of beef scraps and cornmeal, calculating that the animal's shrunken stomach would need gentle reintroduction to regular feeding. The dog's response was encouraging. It approached the food bowl with eagerness, but not desperation, eating steadily, but without the frantic gulping that spoke of starvation. "Getting your strength back," Luke observed with satisfaction. "Give it a week or two of regular meals, and you'll be a different animal entirely." The afternoon brought visitors in the form of Father Miguel, riding his gentle mare with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. The priest's arrival triggered the dog's first display of protective instinct, a low growl that carried warning rather than threat, establishing boundaries without escalating to aggression. "So this is the famous, dangerous dog," Father Miguel said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who spent more time with books than horses. "He doesn't look particularly ferocious from here." Luke emerged from the barn, positioning himself where both men could see he had the situation under control. "Appearances can be deceiving, Padre, but so can reputations." "Indeed they can." Father Miguel's eyes held the kind of gentle wisdom that came from hearing confessions and counseling troubled souls. "Sheriff Bradley stopped by the rectory this morning. He's concerned about your safety, but more concerned about the questions people are starting to ask." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests some folks think you're making a mistake that could endanger others. Carl Brennan's been talking around town, telling stories about what that dog supposedly did in Colorado." Mrs. Patterson's organized the other mothers to petition Sheriff Bradley for official action. Luke felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of community responsibility that had followed him from his cavalry days into civilian life. "And what do you think, Padre? Should I have left that animal chained to die?" Father Miguel studied the dog, which had settled into a watchful but non-threatening posture near the barn door. "I think," he said carefully, "that redemption often requires someone to take a risk on faith rather than evidence. But I also think that faith without wisdom can endanger innocent people." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that if you're right about this animal's true nature, you'll have saved a life and possibly gained a loyal companion. But if you're wrong, if Carl Brennan's stories have any truth to them, then the consequences could be severe for more than just yourself." Luke nodded, understanding the weight of what the priest was telling him without agreeing with it. "Sometimes a man has to choose between being safe and being right, Padre. I've been safe long enough." As Father Miguel prepared to leave, he paused, with one foot in his stirrup. "Luke, I want you to know that whatever happens, I believe your intentions are good. But good intentions don't always protect us from bad outcomes. Be careful, my friend, and be prepared for the possibility that this situation may test more than just your judgment about one animal." That evening, as Luke sat on his porch watching the dog explore the boundaries of its new freedom, he reflected on the priest's words. The animal showed no signs of viciousness. It investigated the ranch with curiosity rather than aggression, gave the cattle a respectful distance, and seemed most content when it could see Luke while maintaining its own space. But Luke also understood that he'd set events in motion that would require resolution beyond his ability to control. Carl Brennan wasn't the type of man to accept defiance quietly, and the community's fears would only grow with time if nothing happened to address them. The dog settled near the porch as darkness fell, close enough for protection but far enough for independence. In the fading light, Luke could see intelligence and gratitude in its eyes, qualities that seemed incompatible with the savage killer of Brennan's stories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, two solitary creatures had found companionship in shared understanding of what it meant to be judged by others' fears rather than one's own actions. 2 weeks had passed since the incident with Rex's injured paw, and Luke had begun to notice subtle changes in the dog's behavior that gave him cautious hope. Rex no longer retreated to the farthest corner of his shelter when Luke approached, and his eating had become more relaxed, less hurried, as if he was beginning to believe that food would continue to be available. But it was the townspeople who were becoming more difficult to manage than the dog. The first sign of organized opposition came when Luke rode into Cedar Falls for supplies and found a small crowd gathered outside Tom Bradley's general store. The conversation stopped abruptly when he dismounted, and Luke could feel the weight of disapproving stares as he made his way up the wooden steps. "Luke," Tom greeted him with obvious discomfort. "We need to talk." Inside the store, Tom's usual friendly demeanor was replaced by the careful tone of someone delivering unwelcome news. "There's been talk, Luke. Concerns about what you're doing out there with that animal." "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that come from people who are worried about their family's safety," Tom replied, avoiding Luke's eyes. "Jake Hayes has been telling folks that the dog nearly broke free from its restraints last week, said it was snapping and snarling like it wanted to tear someone apart." Luke felt a familiar stirring of anger at the distortion of facts, but he kept his voice level. "Rex was frightened because he'd injured himself. Any animal in pain might react defensively. But he was never close to breaking free, and he certainly wasn't trying to attack anyone." "Rex?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "You've given it a name now." The question carried implications that Luke didn't like, as if naming the dog somehow proved that his judgment had been compromised by sentiment. "His name is Rex. It was burned into the collar he was wearing when I found him." Tom nodded slowly, but Luke could see that the distinction didn't matter to him. "The point is, people are scared, Luke. Mary Sullivan's been asking what happens if that thing gets loose and comes into town. Dr. Hammond's been getting questions about treating injuries from wild animal attacks." Luke spent the next hour making his purchases and listening to variations of the same concerns from different people. The consensus seemed to be that while his intentions were admirable, he was taking unacceptable risks with other people's safety. Several folks suggested that the most humane thing would be to put Rex out of his misery, rather than prolonging what everyone assumed must be a miserable existence. The ride back to the line shack gave Luke time to think about the townspeople's fears and his own growing sense of isolation. He understood their concerns. They had every right to worry about potential danger to their families. But their certainty that Rex was irredeemably vicious frustrated him, especially as he watched the dog's daily progress toward something that looked increasingly like trust. When he arrived at the line shack, Luke was surprised to find Rex standing near the spring rather than lying in his usual spot in the shelter. The dog's posture was alert but not aggressive, and his tail, which Luke had never seen move before except in agitation, was held in a neutral position that suggested cautious interest rather than fear. "Well, boy, looks like you're feeling a bit better today," Luke said, dismounting and beginning his usual routine of unpacking supplies. As he worked, Luke became aware that Rex was following his movements with the kind of attention that suggested genuine curiosity. When Luke approached the fire ring to begin preparing their evening meal, Rex took several steps closer, not enough to be within reach, but closer than he had voluntarily come before. Luke continued his work while keeping up his customary conversation with the dog. "Had some interesting discussions in town today. Seems folks have strong opinions about what I should be doing with you." He paused to stir beans in the pot, glancing over to see that Rex had settled into a lying position but was still watching intently. "Most of them think I'm wasting my time, that you're too far gone to be helped." Rex's ears twitched at the sound of Luke's voice, and for a moment his expression seemed almost contemplative, as if he was weighing the meaning behind the words. It was then that something unexpected happened, something so small that Luke almost missed it, but so significant that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Luke was reaching for his water cup, he accidentally knocked over a small tin that contained dried herbs Dr. Hammond had recommended for Rex's injured leg. The tin rolled across the ground, coming to rest about halfway between Luke and the dog. Without thinking, Luke started to rise to retrieve it, but Rex moved first. The dog stood, walked over to the tin, and carefully picked it up in his mouth. Then, instead of retreating to his shelter as Luke might have expected, Rex approached within arm's length and gently dropped the tin at Luke's feet. For a moment, both man and dog stood perfectly still, as if neither quite believed what had just happened. Rex had voluntarily approached Luke, performed what could only be interpreted as a helpful action, and remained close enough to be touched if Luke chose to reach out. Instead, Luke spoke quietly to the dog while slowly reaching down to pick up the tin. "Thank you, Rex. That was real helpful." The simple exchange became the artifact that Luke would treasure more than any physical object. Rex's first voluntary gesture of cooperation, his first indication that he might be capable of something more than mere survival in Luke's presence. It represented a fundamental shift in their relationship, a moment when Rex chose to bridge the gap between fear and trust, even if only briefly. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders were coming up the trail toward the line shack, and Luke recognized them immediately. Samuel Hayes and his 2 sons, all wearing the grim expressions of men who had come to deliver an ultimatum. "Luke," Samuel said without dismounting, "we need to settle this business about the dog once and for all." Rex had immediately retreated to his shelter at the sound of unfamiliar voices, but he remained visible, watching the newcomers with obvious wariness. "What business is that, Samuel?" "The business of you keeping a dangerous animal in territory where it could threaten innocent people. Jake's been telling folks about what he saw here last week. That dog nearly breaking free, acting like it wanted to kill someone." Luke felt his jaw tighten. "Jake wasn't here last week. He doesn't know what he's talking about." "Maybe not," Samuel conceded. "But the fact remains that you're keeping an animal that's been marked dangerous, and people have a right to be concerned about their safety." Jake spoke up from behind his father. "The way I see it, Luke's got 2 choices. He can take that dog somewhere far away from here, or we can solve the problem ourselves." The threat was clear, and Luke felt his hand instinctively move toward the pistol at his hip, but he caught himself, recognizing that violence would only prove the townspeople's point about dangerous creatures. "Rex isn't going anywhere," Luke said quietly, "and neither am I. We're not bothering anyone out here, and we're not planning to." Samuel Hayes studied Luke's face for a long moment, then glanced toward the shelter where Rex waited. "That animal's got you fooled, Luke. I hope, for everyone's sake, that you figure out the truth before it's too late." As the 3 riders departed, Luke realized that his conflict was no longer just about helping an injured dog. He was facing the same kind of judgment that Rex had faced, being condemned as dangerous based on fear rather than evidence, being marked for elimination by people who were convinced they knew the truth without bothering to learn the facts. That evening, as he sat by the fire reading Samuel Morrison's notebook by lamplight, Luke found a passage that seemed to speak directly to his situation. "The greatest obstacle to healing is often not the injured creature's inability to trust, but the community's unwillingness to believe that healing is possible." Looking across the clearing to where Rex lay in his shelter, still wary, still scarred, but no longer completely alone, Luke understood that they were both fighting the same battle against the world's tendency to write off anything that seemed broken beyond repair. The difference was that Rex had someone willing to fight that battle alongside him. Luke had chosen to stand alone, but he was beginning to realize that sometimes standing alone was exactly what courage looked like. The discovery came by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Luke had been following Rex during one of the dog's increasingly frequent explorations around the line shack, curious about the route the animal seemed to favor during his morning walks. Rex had been off the lead rope for 3 days now, a development that had surprised Luke with its naturalness, as if both of them had simply understood that the rope was no longer necessary. Now, watching Rex move with obvious purpose toward a cluster of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile from their camp, Luke found himself wondering if the dog was following some scent or memory that predated their time together. Rex moved differently on these walks, not with the cautious uncertainty he showed around the line shack, but with the confident stride of an animal returning to familiar territory. The cottonwoods marked the edge of what had once been a small homestead. Luke could see the remains of a foundation where a house had stood, now nothing more than scattered stones and the ghostly outline of rooms carved into the prairie grass. A few yards away, the collapsed remains of a barn suggested that this had been a working ranch, though not a large one. Rex went directly to a spot near the house foundation and lay down, his posture alert but peaceful in a way that Luke had never seen before. The dog's behavior was so different from his usual wariness that Luke felt compelled to examine the area more closely. What he found, half hidden by tall grass and partially obscured by a fallen timber from the barn, was a grave marker. Not the elaborate headstone that might mark a plot in a town cemetery, but the kind of simple wooden cross that frontier families erected when they had to bury their own. Luke knelt beside the marker and brushed away the accumulated dirt and debris until he could read the weathered inscription burned into the crosspiece: Thomas Fletcher, beloved husband and father, 1847-1883, died defending his home. Below the inscription, in smaller letters that had been added later in a different hand, his faithful dog Rex keeps watch still. Luke sat back on his heels, feeling pieces of a puzzle suddenly rearranging themselves in his mind. This wasn't just any abandoned homestead. This was Rex's home, the place where he had lived before whatever had happened to turn him from a beloved family pet into something people marked as too dangerous. "You were guarding his grave," Luke said aloud, looking at Rex with new understanding. "That's what you were doing when they found you. Not attacking people for meanness, but protecting what was left of your family." Rex's ears pricked forward at the sound of Luke's voice, and for the first time since Luke had known him, the dog's tail moved in what could unmistakably be called a wag. Not the frantic motion of excitement, but the slow, deliberate movement of an animal, acknowledging that he had been understood. Luke spent the next hour exploring the ruins of the Fletcher homestead, and with each discovery, his understanding of Rex's story deepened. Scattered around the property were the remains of what had obviously been a violent confrontation: splintered wood that bore the marks of bullets, scorched earth where buildings had been set ablaze, and the kinds of debris that spoke of a raid, rather than a simple abandonment. In what had been the barn, Luke found the twisted remains of what appeared to have been a strong box blown apart by dynamite or gunpowder. Near it lay the scattered remnants of what might once have been important papers, deeds, letters, or bank documents that someone had been very interested in finding. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had lived through the lawless years following the Civil War, when bands of raiders had swept through isolated settlements, killing families and looting whatever they could find. The Fletcher place had clearly been hit by such a group, and Thomas Fletcher had died trying to defend his home and family. But the second grave marker, smaller and partially hidden behind a stand of wild roses, completed the picture in a way that made Luke's throat tighten with emotion. Sarah Fletcher and baby son, 1848-1883, together in heaven. Rex had been the sole survivor of a family massacre, left alone to guard the graves of the people he had loved. When well-meaning neighbors or travelers had found him weeks or months later, half-starved and fiercely protective of the burial site, they had misinterpreted his loyalty as dangerous aggression, the crude warning sign that had marked Rex as too dangerous represented one of the cruelest ironies Luke had ever encountered, a faithful dog condemned for the very devotion that made him admirable. Rex's apparent viciousness had been grief and loyalty twisted by starvation and trauma into something that looked like murderous intent. Luke found himself thinking of his father's writings about the war, about men who had been driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control, who had been judged harshly by people who had never faced such tests themselves. "Context," his father had written, "is everything when trying to understand human behavior. What looks like evil from a distance often reveals itself as desperation when examined up close. The same principle applied to Rex, Luke realized. Viewed through the lens of his true story, every aspect of the dog's behavior took on new meaning. His fearfulness around humans made perfect sense for an animal whose last memory of strangers involved violence and death. His protective instincts, his wariness about accepting food from unfamiliar hands, his reluctance to trust, all of it stemmed not from a vicious nature, but from loyalty that had been catastrophically rewarded with loss. But there was more to discover. Searching through the ruins of the main house, Luke found something that had been carefully hidden beneath a loose floorboard. A leather satchel containing papers that the raiders had apparently overlooked. Among them were letters written in a woman's careful handwriting, correspondence between Sarah Fletcher and her sister back east. One letter, dated just weeks before the massacre, contained a passage that struck Luke with particular force. Rex has become such a wonderful companion to little Thomas. The dog seems to understand that his job is to protect our boy, and he takes that responsibility so seriously. Yesterday, he growled at a snake that had slithered too close to where Thomas was playing, and he wouldn't leave the child's side until I had moved the snake away. I sometimes think Rex loves our son almost as much as we do. The letter painted a picture of Rex as he had been before tragedy struck. Not a dangerous animal, but a devoted family guardian whose protective instincts had made him a cherished member of the Fletcher household. The transformation from beloved pet to feared outcast had been the result of circumstances that would have tested any creature's sanity. Luke carefully gathered the letters and documents, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the first person to learn Rex's true story. These papers were more than historical artifacts. They were evidence of Rex's character, proof that the dog's nature had been shaped by love rather than violence. As the afternoon sun began to slant toward evening, Luke called to Rex, who had remained lying beside Thomas Fletcher's grave throughout Luke's exploration of the homestead. The dog rose immediately and trotted over with an alertness that seemed different from his usual cautious attention. "Ready to go home, boy?" Luke asked, and Rex's tail wagged again, stronger this time, more confident. The walk back to the line. Shack felt different than any they had taken before. Rex moved beside Luke rather than trailing behind, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had somehow been released from a burden he had been carrying for months. It was as if returning to the Fletcher place and having his vigil acknowledged by another had given him permission to let go of a responsibility that had been slowly killing him. That evening, as Luke prepared their meal by the fire, he noticed that Rex had begun to exhibit behaviors he had never shown before. The dog approached the fire ring and settled nearby, not with the careful wariness he had always maintained, but with the easy companionship of an animal that had remembered what it felt like to be part of a family. When Luke began reading aloud, from Samuel Morrison's veterinary notebook, a habit he had developed over the past weeks, Rex's ears perked forward with obvious interest. It was a small thing, but it suggested that the dog was beginning to find comfort in human voices rather than just tolerating them. The transformation was remarkable, but Luke understood that it was only the beginning. Rex had spent months believing that his job was to guard the graves of his murdered family, a responsibility that had isolated him from any possibility of new relationships or experiences. Now that he had been relieved of that duty, acknowledged and understood by someone who recognized the nobility of his vigil, he was free to discover what kind of life might still be possible. But Luke also knew that Rex's story, once it became known in Cedar Falls, would change everything about how the townspeople viewed both the dog and the man who had chosen to help him. The question was whether that change would be for better or worse, and whether the community that had condemned Rex without knowing the facts would be willing to reconsider their judgment when presented with the truth. Looking into the fire as Rex dozed peacefully beside him, Luke realized that he was about to find out whether his neighbors possessed the same capacity for growth and redemption that they had been so reluctant to grant to a grieving dog. Luke spent 3 days deciding how to share Rex's story with the people of Cedar Falls. The letters and documents from the Fletcher homestead lay spread across the rough wooden table in the line shack. Each piece of evidence, a fragment of a tragedy that transformed everything the townspeople thought they knew about the dog they had condemned. The challenge wasn't just presenting facts, it was overcoming months of fear and prejudice that had hardened into certainty. Luke had learned enough about human nature to know that people were often more invested in being right than in being corrected, even when the correction revealed their compassion had been misdirected rather than their judgment poor. Rex seemed to sense that something significant was building. The dog had been different since their visit to the Fletcher graves, more relaxed, more willing to engage with Luke, but also more alert to changes in routine. When Luke spent long hours studying the documents or writing in his own journal, Rex would position himself nearby, watching with the attentive patience of a creature that had learned to read human moods. On the 4th morning, Luke made his decision. He would invite the key members of the community to the line shack, show them the evidence of Rex's true nature, and let them meet the dog they had feared without the barrier of their preconceptions. It was a risk. If Rex reacted badly to strangers in his territory, it could confirm their worst fears rather than dispelling them. But Luke had come to believe that truth, presented honestly and completely, had a better chance of changing minds than arguments based on faith alone. His first step was to create a comprehensive account of Rex's story, combining the evidence from the Fletcher homestead with his own observations of the dog's behavior and recovery. Using his father's old journal as a template, Luke wrote carefully and thoroughly, documenting not just the facts of what had happened to the Fletcher family, but the psychological impact it would have had on their surviving dog. The document he produced became something more than a simple report. It was a testament to Rex's character, a record of loyalty that had been misunderstood and devotion that had been mistaken for violence. Luke included sketches of the grave markers, transcriptions of Sarah Fletcher's letters about Rex's gentle nature with her son, and detailed descriptions of the evidence at the homestead that supported his conclusions about what had really happened. But creating the document was only the first challenge. The second was deciding whom to invite to hear Rex's story and in what order. Luke understood that the success or failure of his effort would depend largely on getting the right people to see the truth first, those whose opinions carried weight in the community and who possessed the intellectual honesty to change their minds when presented with compelling evidence. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond was his first choice. Her medical training had given her experience in diagnosing conditions based on symptoms, and her general reputation for fairness meant that her opinion would influence others. Margaret Morrison was another obvious candidate. She had already shown willingness to help, and her late husband's expertise with traumatized animals gave her relevant experience. Tom Bradley presented a more complex decision. As the owner of the general store and one of the town's informal leaders, his opinion mattered greatly, but Tom had been among the most vocal in expressing concerns about Rex's presence in the territory. Convincing him would be crucial, but Luke wasn't certain whether Tom's mind was open to being changed. The most difficult decision concerned the Hayes family. Samuel Hayes was a reasonable man, but his sons, particularly Jake, had been instrumental in spreading fear about Rex throughout the community. Including them risked a confrontation that could derail Luke's careful planning, but excluding them would allow them to claim later that they had been denied the opportunity to evaluate the evidence. After considerable thought, Luke decided to start with the people most likely to be receptive, Dr. Hammond and Margaret Morrison, and then expand the group based on their responses. If he could convince the first few visitors that Rex represented no danger to the community, they could help persuade others who might be more skeptical. Luke spent a morning making Rex as presentable as possible. The dog's coat had improved dramatically. During their time at the line shack, regular meals and medical care had restored much of its natural luster, and the worst of the matting had been carefully worked out. More importantly, Rex's overall demeanor had changed. The constant tension that had characterized his early behavior had been replaced by a calm alertness that made him look more like a working dog than a dangerous predator. The leather muzzle, that had once been necessary for everyone's safety, now seemed not just unnecessary, but insulting, a symbol of the fear and misunderstanding that Luke hoped to dispel. Rex had not shown any aggressive behavior in over a week, and Luke felt confident that the dog could interact safely with visitors who approached him with respect rather than fear. On the appointed day, Dr. Hammond arrived first, riding up to the line shack with the calm professionalism that characterized her approach to most situations. Luke met her at the edge of the clearing, giving her a chance to observe Rex from a distance before any direct interaction. "He looks different than I expected," Dr. Hammond admitted, studying Rex as he lay peacefully in the shade of his shelter. "When people described him, I was picturing something more feral." "That's part of what I wanted to show you," Luke replied, handing her the document he had prepared. What people saw when they found Rex wasn't his true nature. It was grief and trauma masquerading as aggression. Dr. Hammond read through Luke's account with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence objectively. Her medical background helped her understand the psychological principles Luke described, and her experience with frontier hardships gave her context for the tragedy that had shaped Rex's behavior. "This is remarkable work, Luke," she said when she finished reading. "The documentation is thorough, and your analysis of the dog's psychological state is quite sophisticated. But the real test will be whether Rex can demonstrate that he's recovered enough to interact safely with strangers." Luke called Rex over, and the dog responded immediately, approaching with the easy confidence he had shown over the past few days. Dr. Hammond extended her hand for Rex to sniff, then carefully stroked his head when he showed no signs of tension or fear. "His physical condition has improved dramatically," Dr. Hammond observed. "The coat is healthy, the eyes are clear, and his overall demeanor suggests good nutrition and regular care. More importantly, his behavior around strangers seems completely different from what was described to me." Margaret Morrison arrived an hour later, and her reaction to Rex was even more positive than Dr. Hammond's. Her experience with her late husband's animal rehabilitation work gave her an immediate understanding of what Luke had accomplished. "Samuel would have been proud of this work," Margaret said, watching Rex interact calmly with both visitors. "This dog has been completely transformed from the creature I heard described in town." The real test came when Tom Bradley arrived, bringing with him the skeptical caution of someone who had heard too many stories about Rex's dangerous nature to trust easily in his rehabilitation. But Tom was also an honest man, and when confronted with evidence that contradicted his preconceptions, he proved willing to reconsider his position. "I have to admit, Luke, this isn't what I expected to find," Tom said, after spending an hour with Rex and reading through the documentation. "That dog's as gentle as any ranch dog I've worked with, and these letters from the Fletcher woman, they paint a completely different picture of his character." By the end of the afternoon, Luke had achieved more than he had dared to hope. All three visitors had been convinced not only that Rex posed no danger to the community, but that he represented an example of loyalty and devotion that deserved to be celebrated rather than feared. But even as Luke felt encouraged by their responses, he knew that the real challenge still lay ahead. The people he had convinced today were already predisposed to trust his judgment and consider evidence objectively. The broader community included individuals who might be more resistant to changing their minds, regardless of what facts were presented to them. Dr. Hammond helped him develop a strategy for approaching the more skeptical members of the community. Rather than trying to arrange another group meeting, they decided that each of the day's visitors would speak individually with specific people, sharing what they had learned and inviting them to visit the line shack to see Rex for themselves. The key, Dr. Hammond explained, is to make it clear that we're not asking people to take our word for anything. We're inviting them to evaluate the evidence and reach their own conclusions. People are more likely to accept a truth they feel they've discovered themselves. Margaret Morrison agreed to speak with the other ranchers in the area, many of whom would understand the principles of animal behavior and rehabilitation that Luke had applied with Rex. Tom Bradley would approach the merchants and townspeople, who looked to him for leadership on practical matters. But Luke knew that the ultimate test would come when the Hayes family learned about his discoveries. Samuel Hayes was a reasonable man, but his sons had invested considerable pride in their assessment of Rex as irredeemably dangerous. Convincing them to reconsider would require not just evidence, but a willingness on their part to admit they had been wrong about something they had spoken about with great certainty. As his visitors prepared to leave, Luke felt a mixture of hope and apprehension about what the next few days would bring. Rex's true story was about to become public knowledge, and with it would come a reckoning, not just about one dog's fate, but about the community's willingness to choose understanding over fear, compassion over convenience. That evening, as Luke sat by the fire with Rex resting peacefully beside him, he found himself thinking about his father's writings on courage. Physical bravery, his father had observed, was often easier than moral courage. It was simpler to face an enemy with a gun than to face a community with the truth they didn't want to hear. Tomorrow would reveal whether Cedar Falls possessed the collective wisdom to acknowledge that they had condemned an innocent creature, and whether they were capable of the grace that would allow them to celebrate Rex's true nature instead of clinging to their misconceptions about his character. The fire crackled in the growing darkness, and Rex sighed contentedly as he settled deeper into sleep. For tonight, at least, there was peace between man and dog, and the hope that tomorrow might bring the same peace between Rex and the world that had judged him so harshly. The confrontation came sooner than Luke had expected, and in a way that transformed his careful plans into desperate improvisation. He was returning from the spring with water buckets when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the line shack at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a social visit. 6 riders emerged from the morning heat shimmer, the entire Hayes family, plus 2 men Luke recognized as neighbors who had been vocal in their opposition to Rex's presence in the territory. They rode with the grim purpose of a delegation that had come to settle matters once and for all. Rex sensed the tension immediately. The dog rose from his resting spot and moved closer to Luke, not with the cowering fear he had once shown around strangers, but with the alert readiness of an animal prepared to defend his territory if necessary. "Luke Carson," Samuel Hayes called out as the group approached. "We need to talk." Luke set down the water buckets and walked forward to meet them, conscious that Rex was following a few steps behind. "I'm listening, Samuel. Word is you've been showing that dog to people, trying to convince them it's safe. My boys tell me you've got Tom Bradley and some others believing your animal isn't dangerous anymore." Samuel's expression was grave but not hostile. He seemed more concerned than angry, but good intentions and wishful thinking don't change facts. Jake Hayes spurred his horse a step closer, his young face set in the stubborn lines of someone who had been contradicted and didn't like it. "People in town are starting to think maybe they were wrong about that dog, but we know better, don't we, Luke? We've seen what that thing is really like when it's cornered." Luke felt his temper rising at the deliberate distortion, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What you saw, Jake, was an injured animal that was scared and in pain. That's not the same thing as vicious, is that right?" One of the neighbors, a rancher named Willis Carter, spoke up from behind the Hayes men. "Because I heard from Jake that the dog nearly broke free and went after him personally. Sounds pretty vicious to me." Luke looked directly at Jake Hayes. seeing the young man's eyes shift away from his steady gaze. "Jake, you want to tell these men the truth about what happened that day, or are you going to let them make decisions based on a story you know isn't accurate?" Jake's face flushed red, but his father spoke before he could respond. "The point isn't what happened then, Luke. The point is what could happen tomorrow or next week. You can't guarantee that dog won't hurt someone, and the rest of us shouldn't have to live with that risk." "You're right, Samuel," Luke replied. "I can't guarantee anything, but I can show you evidence of what Rex really is, if you're willing to look at it with an open mind." Luke walked to his saddlebags and pulled out the leather satchel containing the Fletcher family documents. "This dog you're so afraid of isn't dangerous. He's a hero, and I can prove it." Over the next several minutes, Luke laid out Rex's story, with the same methodical care he had used with Dr. Hammond and the others. He showed them Sarah Fletcher's letters describing Rex's gentle nature with her child, explained the evidence at the homestead that revealed the family's tragic end, and described how Rex's apparent aggression had actually been grief-stricken loyalty to his murdered family. The men listened in silence, some with obvious skepticism, others with growing surprise as the true scope of the tragedy became clear. When Luke finished, Samuel Hayes studied the documents for a long moment before speaking. "This is a sad story, Luke, and if it's true, I feel sorry for what this dog went through. But that doesn't change the fact that trauma can break an animal's mind just like it breaks a man's. Sometimes the kindest thing is to admit when something can't be fixed." "But he is fixed," Luke insisted. "Rex has been living peacefully here for weeks. He's gentle, obedient, and hasn't shown a trace of aggression toward anyone who treats him with respect." Jake Hayes snorted derisively. "He's got you fooled, Luke, but that doesn't mean he's safe around normal people. What happens when some kid wanders up to him? What happens when he gets startled or frightened?" It was at that moment, as if summoned by the question, that a child's voice rang out across the clearing. "Papa! Papa, where are you?" Everyone turned to see a small figure stumbling through the brush at the edge of the clearing. Willis Carter's 6-year-old son, Timothy, who had apparently followed the adults without being noticed. The boy was crying and obviously lost, his clothes torn by thorns and his face streaked with tears and dirt. The sight of 6 mounted men and a large dog should have sent the child running in fear, but Timothy was too upset and confused to assess the situation properly. Instead, he ran directly toward the group, sobbing and calling for his father. Rex's response became the moment that defined everything that followed, the artifact that would remain in Luke's memory as the clearest proof of the dog's true character. Rather than reacting with alarm or aggression to the sudden appearance of a crying child, Rex moved forward with gentle purpose, positioning himself between Timothy and the nervous horses. The dog approached the frightened boy with the same careful patience Luke had seen him use around the spring when testing whether the water was safe to drink. Rex lowered his head to Timothy's level and allowed the child to grab onto his neck, providing a stable anchor point for the boy's emotional storm. "Easy, son," Willis Carter called out, dismounting quickly and moving toward his child. "Just hold still." But Timothy had already stopped crying, his attention captured by the large, gentle dog who had appeared at exactly the moment he needed comfort. Rex stood perfectly still as the boy buried his face in the dog's neck, his tail wagging slowly in the relaxed rhythm of an animal, providing reassurance rather than seeking attention. Willis Carter knelt beside his son and Rex, his expression transformed by what he was witnessing. "Timothy, how did you get here? We told you to stay with your mother." "I got lost," the boy sniffled, still clinging to Rex's neck. "But this nice dog found me. He's not scary like everyone said." The silence that followed was profound. 6 men, who had come to confront Luke about harboring a dangerous animal, found themselves watching that same animal provide comfort and protection to a lost child with a gentleness that revealed his true nature more clearly than any document or testimony could have done. Samuel Hayes was the first to speak, his voice quiet with the recognition of truth that could not be denied. Luke, I owe you an apology. We all do. But Jake Hayes wasn't ready to concede defeat. One good moment doesn't prove anything. That dog could still turn on someone without. Warning! Luke looked at Jake with a mixture of pity and frustration. What would it take to convince you, Jake? What evidence would be enough to change your mind? Jake's jaw tightened with the stubborn pride of someone who had staked his reputation on being right about something that was proving to be wrong. Nothing you could show me would make me trust that animal around my family. It was Willis Carter who ended the standoff, speaking with the absolute authority of a father whose child had been helped rather than harmed by the dog everyone had feared. Jake, I don't know what your problem is with this dog, but I know what I just saw. Rex here treated my boy better than some people would have. If Luke says he's safe, that's good enough for me. As the group prepared to leave, Luke realized that the confrontation had accomplished more than his careful planning ever could have. Rex had proven his character not through Luke's arguments or documentation, but through his own actions when, faced with an unexpected test of his nature. The real climax, Luke understood, wasn't going to be about convincing people with evidence. It was going to be about whether the community could accept the truth about their own prejudices when that truth was demonstrated undeniably before their eyes. The resolution came not through argument, but through crisis, as life's most important lessons often do. 2 days after the confrontation at the line shack, Luke was awakened before dawn by the sound of a horse being ridden hard through the darkness. Rex lifted his head from where he lay near the dying fire, his ears alert to the approaching hoofbeats. Billy Hayes pulled up his lathered horse in a cloud of dust and moonlight, his young face tight with panic. "Luke, thank God you're here. We need help. Need it bad." Luke was on his feet immediately, reaching for his boots. "What's wrong?" "It's Jake," Billy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "He was riding fence line up in Dead Horse Canyon yesterday evening, and his horse came back without him. Pa and I searched until dark, but we couldn't find any trace. We're heading out again at first light, but—" Billy's voice broke. "There's been sign of that wolf pack that's been working the North Range. If Jake's hurt and can't move—" Luke was already saddling Rosie, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to respond to emergencies without wasting time on unnecessary words. But Billy's next words stopped him cold. "Luke, I know what I'm asking. I know Jake's been your biggest problem in town, said things about you and Rex that weren't fair. But he's still my brother, and if there's any chance Rex could help track him—" Luke looked at Rex, who had risen and was watching the conversation with obvious attention. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and his posture suggested he understood that something urgent was happening, even if he couldn't comprehend the details. "Rex isn't trained for tracking people, Billy. He's a cattle dog, not a bloodhound. But he knows the country better than any of us," Billy pressed. "He lived wild out here for months, learned every creek bed and game trail, and Dr. Hammond says dogs can smell things we can't even imagine. Maybe he could find something we'd miss." Luke felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Taking Rex into a search party would mean trusting the dog's behavior around a group of armed, anxious men. If something went wrong, if Rex showed any sign of the aggression people expected from him, it would undo all the progress Luke had made in changing minds about the dog's character. But Jake Hayes was missing, possibly injured, in territory where wolves had been confirmed. Whatever personal animosity existed between Jake and Luke seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that Rex's abilities might make the difference between finding Jake alive or finding him too late. "Saddle up," Luke said finally. "We'll meet you at your place." The ride to the Hayes Ranch took 20 minutes through country that Luke had never seen Rex navigate at speed. The dog ran alongside Rosie with an endurance and sure-footedness that spoke of his months surviving in the wilderness. More importantly, Rex seemed to understand the urgency of their mission, maintaining pace without complaint despite the demanding terrain. At the ranch, they joined a search party that included Samuel Hayes, 3 neighboring ranchers, and Dr. Hammond, who had brought medical supplies in case Jake was found injured. The group's reaction to Rex's presence was mixed. Some nodded acknowledgement, others watched the dog warily, but no one objected to including him in the search. Samuel Hayes took charge with the calm authority of a man who had organized searches before. Dead Horse Canyon runs for about 3 miles, with half a dozen side ravines where a man could fall and not be visible from the main trail. We'll spread out in pairs, work our way up from the mouth of the canyon. Luke and Rex were paired with Dr. Hammond, a decision that Luke suspected Samuel had made deliberately to ensure that the most objective member of the group could observe Rex's behavior during the search. The canyon earned its name honestly. It was a narrow, treacherous passage between high rock walls, with loose scree and hidden drop-offs that made it dangerous for horses even in good light. They had been searching for less than an hour when Rex suddenly stopped, his head raised and nostrils working as he tested the air. "He's caught something," Luke said quietly, dismounting to examine Rex's behavior more closely. Rex moved forward slowly, nose to the ground, following a scent trail that was invisible to human senses. His movements were deliberate and focused, the behavior of a working dog rather than a pet. Luke followed on foot, leading Rosie, and calling back to Dr. Hammond to alert the other searchers. The trail led to a narrow ravine that branched off from the main canyon, exactly the kind of hidden danger Samuel Hayes had warned about. At the bottom, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, lay Jake Hayes, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound where he had apparently struck a rock during his fall. "Jake!" Luke called down, but there was no response. The young man appeared to be breathing, but the blood on the rocks around his head suggested a serious injury. Dr. Hammond arrived as Luke was studying the ravine walls, trying to determine the safest way to reach the injured man. "It's a 12-foot drop, but the walls are too steep to climb down safely. We'll need ropes and at least 3 men to get him out of there." It was Rex who provided the solution. While the humans were discussing logistics, the dog had found a narrow ledge that spiraled partway down the ravine wall, a natural path that a sure-footed animal could navigate. Without being asked or commanded, Rex began picking his way carefully down the ledge toward the unconscious man. "Rex, no!" Luke called, afraid that the dog might injure himself attempting the dangerous descent. But Rex continued, with careful determination, reaching Jake Hayes and immediately positioning himself between the injured man and the edge of the drop-off. More importantly, Rex began the low, steady barking that working dogs use to alert their handlers to danger or injury. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, providing the other search parties with an audible beacon that led them directly to the rescue site. When the ropes finally brought Jake Hayes to safety, he was conscious but disoriented. His first clear words, spoken while Dr. Hammond examined his injuries, were addressed to the dog that had found him. "That's Rex, isn't it?" Jake asked weakly, focusing with difficulty on the dog that sat nearby. "I remember him from the other day. Good boy, Rex, good boy." The ride back to the Hayes ranch was quiet, with Jake secured to a makeshift stretcher between 2 horses and Rex trotting alongside as if he understood his role as guardian of the injured man. Luke found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. Jake Hayes, who had been Rex's most vocal opponent, owed his life to the dog he had condemned as dangerous. Back at the ranch house, as Dr. Hammond worked to treat Jake's concussion and the other searchers shared the story of Rex's crucial role in the rescue, Luke realized that something fundamental had changed in how the dog was perceived by the community. Samuel Hayes approached Luke as they prepared to leave. "Luke, I want you to know that what happened today, what Rex did, that's the act of a dog that's got the heart to risk his own safety for someone else's welfare. That's not the behavior of a dangerous animal." Jake Hayes, propped up on pillows and looking pale but alert, managed to catch Luke's eye as he prepared to leave. "Luke, I owe you an apology, and I owe Rex more than I can ever repay. I was wrong about him, wrong about what you were trying to do. I'm sorry." Luke nodded acceptance of the apology, but his attention was on Rex, who had taken a position near Jake's bedside and seemed reluctant to leave the injured man. It was the behavior of a dog who understood that his job included protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of how they had treated him in the past. The ride home to the line shack felt different than any they had taken before, not just because of the successful rescue, but because of what it represented about Rex's character and Luke's judgment. The dog that had once been marked as too dangerous had proven himself to be exactly the opposite when faced with a real test of his nature. As they settled by their fire that evening, Luke realized that the true climax of their story hadn't been about convincing anyone of Rex's worth. It had been about Rex demonstrating that worth through actions that spoke louder than any argument or evidence ever could. 3 months later, Luke stood on the front porch of the small house that Margaret Morrison had helped him build on the edge of her property, watching Rex play with a litter of barn kittens that had adopted the big dog as their unlikely guardian. The scene would have been impossible to imagine during those first difficult days at the line shack, when Rex's every movement had been governed by fear and suspicion. The transformation in the dog was remarkable, but perhaps more remarkable was the transformation in the community's understanding of what they had almost lost through their own prejudice and fear. Rex had become something of a local hero after his role in finding Jake Hayes, and children who had once been warned to stay away from the dangerous dog now sought him out for the gentle companionship he offered so readily. Dr. Hammond had been particularly interested in documenting Rex's recovery, both for her own understanding of animal psychology and as a case study that might help other communities avoid similar mistakes in the future. Rex's story, she had written in her medical journal, demonstrates that our assumptions about damaged creatures, whether human or animal, often say more about our own limitations than about their potential for healing. The morning mail brought a letter that Luke had been expecting but still felt nervous about opening. The territorial government had been investigating the massacre at the Fletcher homestead, following up on the evidence Luke had discovered, and they had promised to send word when their inquiry was complete. Luke opened the letter carefully, conscious that Rex had stopped his play with the kittens and was watching with the attentive curiosity he always showed when Luke received correspondence. The dog had learned to associate letters with changes in routine, and his intelligence continued to surprise Luke with its depth and complexity. The letter confirmed what Luke had suspected. The Fletcher family had been killed by a gang of raiders who had been systematically targeting isolated homesteads throughout the territory. The gang had eventually been captured and executed, but not before they had destroyed several families and left survivors like Rex to cope with trauma that no one had understood at the time. More significantly, the territorial government was establishing a fund to provide care for animals orphaned by criminal activity, using Rex's story as an example of how patience and understanding could reclaim lives that might otherwise be lost. Luke's documentation of Rex's recovery had played a crucial role in convincing officials that such efforts were worthwhile. "Well, boy," Luke said, folding the letter and looking at Rex, "looks like your story is going to help other animals who find themselves in similar situations. That's quite a legacy for a dog who was once considered too dangerous to live." Rex's tail wagged at the sound of Luke's voice, but his attention was caught by the approach of a familiar horse and rider. Margaret Morrison was returning from town, her saddlebags heavy with supplies and her expression carrying the satisfied look of someone who had accomplished everything on her list. "Any word from the territorial government?" she asked as she dismounted. Though her question was more politeness than curiosity, Luke had kept her informed about the investigation from the beginning. "They're using Rex's case to establish a program for helping traumatized animals," Luke replied, showing her the letter. Says here that they want to send other ranchers copies of my documentation. Use it as a guide for dealing with similar situations. Margaret nodded approvingly as she read. Samuel Morrison would have been pleased to know that his veterinary notes helped save more than just one dog. Sometimes the best legacy we can leave is the knowledge that helps others avoid our mistakes. Afternoon brought visitors that had become routine over the past months. Townspeople who had initially feared Rex now stopped by regularly to see how he was doing, and several families had developed traditions of including the dog in their Sunday picnics or holiday celebrations. Rex had become woven into the social fabric of Cedar Falls in a way that would have seemed impossible during those first tense weeks. Tom Bradley arrived with his weekly delivery of supplies, accompanied as usual by his 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, who had appointed herself Rex's special friend and advocate. The girl's fearless affection for the big dog had done more to change adult attitudes than any amount of documentation or testimony could have accomplished. "Rex, I brought you." "Something?" Sarah announced, pulling a carefully wrapped package from her father's wagon. Inside was a new leather collar, handcrafted by the town's harness maker, and decorated with brass fittings that caught the afternoon sunlight. Luke helped Sarah put the collar on Rex, noting how the dog stood perfectly still during the process, accepting the attention with the patient dignity that had become his trademark. The old collar, the one that had borne the burned inscription of his name and connected him to his tragic past, had been retired to a place of honor in Luke's personal belongings, a reminder of how far they had both traveled. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Luke found himself thinking about the passage in his father's journal that had guided him through the most difficult parts of Rex's rehabilitation. A man's character isn't measured by how he treats those who can help him, but by how he treats those who can't. Rex had been unable to help himself when Luke found him, traumatized, abandoned, condemned by people who had judged him without understanding his story. But in choosing to help Rex anyway, Luke had discovered something about his own character that had changed how he saw himself and his place in the world. The job with Margaret Morrison had become more than just employment. It had become a partnership that allowed Luke to use his skills with animals to help other creatures that needed second chances. Word had spread throughout the territory about the man who had saved the dangerous dog, and Luke found himself consulted regularly about difficult cases involving traumatized or misunderstood animals. Rex had proven to be not just a companion, but a partner in this work. His own experience with trauma gave him an intuitive understanding of other damaged creatures, and his gentle approach often succeeded where more conventional methods failed. The dog, who had once been considered too dangerous to live, had become a healer of other broken spirits. As darkness settled over the prairie and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Luke called Rex to the porch where they had developed a tradition of spending their evenings together. The dog settled beside Luke's chair with a contented sigh, his presence as comfortable and natural as if they had been companions for years rather than months. Looking at Rex in the lamplight streaming from the house windows, Luke marveled at the transformation they had both undergone. The fearful, aggressive animal that had been chained to a fence post with a warning sign had become a beloved member of a community that had once been determined to destroy him. The lonely cowboy who had been drifting from job to job without purpose had found meaning in the simple act of choosing compassion over convenience. Sometimes, Luke reflected, the most broken things truly were the ones most worth saving. Not because the saving was easy or because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the act of saving something revealed qualities in the saver that might otherwise have remained hidden. Rex shifted positions slightly, resting his head against Luke's leg with the trusting affection that had replaced the fear that had once defined him. In that simple gesture, Luke found all the confirmation he needed that some choices, the hardest ones, the ones that required the most faith, were also the ones that mattered most. The night was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the prairie. settling into darkness, and Rex's breathing had taken on the steady rhythm of approaching sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that redemption was possible for any creature willing to accept it. But tonight, there was peace between man and dog, and the deep satisfaction that came from understanding that love, given freely and without condition, had the power to heal wounds that seemed beyond repair.